Hello. Today I'd like to talk to you about food and conflict, how climate change can affect food production, availability, and cost, and how these factors can relate to scarcity and potentially civil conflict or low level violence. And this is a topic that builds on previous weeks' discussions about water scarcity, water abundance, and conflict, and economic and political factors shaping the causes of civil conflict. And I think if one thing I've taken away from the last couple of months with the huge spending by the Australian and other governments around the world, how it has shaped food availability and cost, it is that it is getting more expensive. This article recently came out, showed how a packet of crisps in Australia almost cost $6, and how the real cost for people to be able to buy necessities has gotten more expensive. And this has been connected to broader trends about global food price rises. Here in Australia, the average is about $10 more per week, whether it is for essentials like, well, I guess these are academic essentials of bread and wine, but for other things that are actual essentials, $10 can be hugely important for those that have a scarce amount of resources to pay for basic necessities, as we'll see later on in these series of videos. And you would think that given $6 for a bag of potato chips and the huge price rises in other foodstuffs that we've seen in Australia, that there would be people hitting the streets and protesting the increased cost of living. However, we really haven't seen that here in Australia. However, as things get more expensive and as farmers' lives become more difficult, it is actually an important driver of protest and violence in a whole bunch of different countries around the world. We're going to look at the case of the Omo River Valley in Ethiopia and the Kenyan border region. But I thought I would start by some countries that would potentially be more similar to Australia in more developed protests, and that would be in France. There is no country that quite loves a protest, especially by farmers, than France. There's a lot of different cases. This protest from 2019 in Paris, by a whole bunch of farmers bringing their tractors to the center of Paris. The yellow vest movement also in France starting in 2018. But farmers really do it really creatively. From dumping pumpkins in Vaucluse in 2014 to flinging something that leads you to grow pumpkins in 2014. Let's leave it at that. Fertilizer, to some absolutely gorgeous looking apples in Marseille in the also after the growing season in 2014. You can find a bunch of examples if you go back through recent French history of farmer protests, from protesting McDonald's to dumping entire trucks of tomatoes and other kind of foodstuffs. It is a way to show how farmers are dissatisfied with how much it costs to actually produce the goods that both people in France as well as around the world depend on. And so that's just one example of the political pressure that agriculturists can try to bring to bear in developed countries, but this is not something that's unique to developed countries. You can see articles like this one in Foreign Policy a couple of years ago that connects explicitly the cost of food and political dissatisfaction within countries, social unrest. After the government subsidy for bread products in Egypt was removed a couple of years ago, there was huge food protests, and the government had to backtrack a little bit on that. There's been a wide understanding of the importance of food production and people's ability to be able to have enough to eat, to providing motivation to go to conflict or to be able to break the law, right? French examples, going back to Les Miserables with Hugo and stealing a loaf of bread, causing everybody's problems, through to widespread starvation and famine. In the country that we're going to look at later on today, in Ethiopia, the 1980s, there was a widespread famine that led to huge international attention and recognition of this being a problem in parts of the world in which you have certain parts of the world with huge amounts of abundance and others with dramatic scarcity. Kind of raise the awareness of the importance to spend money on development in the developing world, but it goes back a lot further than that. Last week we talked about how water scarcity and water conflicts have been with us pretty much since the dawn of recorded history, but food availability and food being a rallying cry for trying to challenge authority figures goes back a lot further, dating back, of course, to the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 2017 and their widespread issues with food availability, going back with the unequal distribution of land ownership and serfs having to work the land as a prime motivation for trying to get the working class to rise up there. But then also, once the political powers came to the positions of power in the Soviet Union, they also turned around and made political decisions that had consequences on discrete parts of society within the country. And this kind of brings me to Ukraine. I know Russia and Ukraine are in the news now in 2022 for a very different reason, but there is, as with a lot of neighboring countries or countries that were occupied by other countries, a history of political decisions that ended up having consequences. And here is the Holodomor Memorial in Kyiv. And Holodomor, I don't think most Australian students would be aware of this widespread famine that Australia declared a genocide in 2003, but it is important to try to understand the historic relationships between different states. It comes from the Ukrainian words for hunger and extermination. It was a man-made famine in 1932 and 1933. It was a part of a broader Soviet famine, resulting from an efforts to collectivize agriculture by Stalin. Last week we talked about Stalin's role in diverting the waters of the Amu Darya from the Aral Sea into cotton production in what is now Uzbekistan. There were also other unanticipated consequences in Ukraine and in other parts of the Soviet Union, not just in the Ukraine, but at least 5 million people died of hunger in 3 or 4 years. The vast majority of them were Ukrainian, 3.9 million. It wasn't mentioned in the USSR until 1986. 16 countries have now mentioned it as a genocide, but it goes to show how you can lead to peasant uprisings and widespread deportations of the kulaks to try to redistribute resources and economic production within a country. So this is an example of food scarcity causing a famine that doesn't get talked that much. In my political science classes, the great leap forward would be an instance in China of government's decisions to focus on different forms of agricultural production that also cause a widespread famine, but there's also other ones in countries that you might not have heard of. Food shocks, food price shocks, and instability. There's a big literature on that. I don't have time to cover it all today, but if you're interested, I know some students in my class are doing papers on food price shocks and conflict, or food production and conflict. But as you can see here from this foreign policy report that I showed you the screenshot of earlier, when food prices spike, the likelihood of having people protesting that are quite noticeably closely linked. You see that spike after the global financial crisis in 2007, 2008, and then also in 2011 with the Arab Spring. So I think today I really want to focus on the potential as well as actual examples of resource conflicts or disputes related to land use, agricultural use, and access to just foodstuffs that could be grown or grazed on the land. The motivating question for me today is, how is food production and consumption linked to human security and conflict? In this class, we have broken down the different parts of a multi-step story linking climate factors, environmental scarcity factors with human security, our ability to be able to live long and healthy lives, and how scarcity can also link to conflict. So it's a multi-step story, and in this lecture today, I want to kind of play through that and link it to weeks 11 and weeks 12, to what governments and international organizations can do to try to mitigate the risk of resource scarcity having a destabilizing effect in countries around the world. And I'm also going to bring in an example to link it to the Ethiopian case. The fact that there was a time in which we thought that getting U2, George Michael, and others on stage would be able to feed the world and make the world a better place. And so with that, I will turn to now a bit of information about food security trends, how food security is conceptualized, how it's measured, and some initial patterns to show how there's dramatic differences around the world as well as within countries for how easy or how hard it is to get the essentials of life, and what effect that has on political and economic relations in those areas. So let's go ahead and turn to that now.